In the early 13th century, a unified Mongol war machine swept across the map, consuming established superpowers with terrifying speed. This map illustrates the sheer scale of their reach. Within 50 years of Genghis Khan's death, his descendants controlled a continuous landmass stretching from the borders of Egypt all the way to the seas of Japan. Yet one region consistently defied their total control: the Indian subcontinent. It was insulated by extreme geography. The Himalayas provided a massive wall of ice to the north, while the Indian Ocean secured the south. The only viable route for a land invasion was a narrow geographical corridor in the northwest, running through modern-day Pakistan. The terrain funneled any invading army into a strict choke point. But geography alone cannot stop a moving army. The subcontinent required a permanent human shield to plug the gap. At that time, the Delhi Sultanate was ruled by a dynasty of former Mamluk slaves. They watched the Mongol armies massing at their borders, knowing full well what would happen if that corridor was breached. The Sultanate's existing military structure was ill-equipped for the threat. Like most medieval states, they relied on decentralized provincial governors to supply troops on demand. By the time a scattered army could be assembled, Mongol cavalry would already be deep inside their territory. Sultan Balban revolutionized the military. He stripped governors of autonomy, consolidating provincial forces into one central standing army. He deployed this force to the northwest choke point. Old fortresses were rebuilt, forming two continuous lines of defense, commanded by his sons. Through these reforms, Balban replaced the fragmented feudal response with a unified defensive shield, prioritizing border integrity above the autonomy of his governors. The strategy worked, but the survival of the frontier came at a high personal price. Balban's eldest son, Prince Muhammad, successfully repelled a major Mongol assault, only to be killed in a surprise ambush while resting near a river. The news broke the aging sultan. Balban died of grief 2 years later, triggering a succession crisis that eventually placed the ruthless Alauddin Khilji on the throne. Khilji faced a rapidly deteriorating border. The Mongol warbands were growing in size and frequency. To match them, the Sultanate needed a military force far larger than its current revenues could support. Khilji's solution was a total restructuring of the civilian economy. This economic model reveals how he artificially capped agricultural profits and fixed market prices, forcing every available resource to flow directly into rapidly expanding the armed forces. Battlefield tactics were now secondary. The survival of the Sultanate depended entirely on this centralized economic engine, built exclusively to maintain an endless state of war. But the system was fragile when overextended. Seeking further wealth, Khilji marched his massive army south to lay siege to a fortress. The siege dragged on for 7 exhausting months, pinning his main force far from the border. The Mongols seized the opportunity. A massive invasion force poured through the unguarded northwest gateway, bypassed the chain of border forts entirely, and rode directly for the unprotected capital of Delhi. Khilji abandoned his campaign and force-marched his army back north. He reached Delhi just ahead of the Mongols, but his soldiers were exhausted, and heavy rains had severely damaged their bows and equipment. A direct confrontation would have meant certain defeat. Instead of risking his depleted forces in the open, Khilji fortified his position outside the city. This tactical layout shows how he anchored his camp against a river to protect 3 flanks, dug a massive trench across the only land bridge, and strictly ordered his generals to hold the line. For 2 months, the Mongols pillaged the surrounding markets, but could not breach the defensive perimeter. The Sultanate survived by refusing the glory of open combat, turning the conflict into a grinding, calculated standoff until the Mongols finally retreated. The final escalation arrived a few years later. The incoming Mongol force brought their families with them, signaling an intent to conquer and settle the subcontinent permanently. Khilji managed to defeat this massive incursion in a brutal, decisive battle, but he recognized that endless defensive lines were unsustainable. To stop the invasions permanently, he needed to break their psychological will to return. He ordered all captured Mongol prisoners to be brought forward and executed by being crushed beneath the feet of war elephants. Then, outside the main fortress, he commanded the construction of towering minarets built entirely from the skulls of the 100,000 dead Mongols. while the surviving women and children were sold into slavery. The Sultanate institutionalized this calculated brutality to ensure that future Mongol incursions were discouraged by the psychological weight of these monuments. The terror tactics achieved their goal. The traumatized Mongol factions completely abandoned their campaigns, leaving India free from major invasions for a full century. The silence was broken not by Genghis Khan's descendant, but by Timur, a Central Asian warlord who violently co-opted the Mongol war machine. Timur bypassed the aging border defenses, sacked Delhi, and reportedly executed 100,000 civilians in a single night. His raid crippled the massive state apparatus that Balban and Khilji had sacrificed everything to build. Yet Timur did not stay to rule. It took another century for his descendant, Babar, to march through that same corridor and establish the Mughal Empire. The existential threat from the steppes forced India to mutate into a heavily centralized military fortress. But in the end, it was the bloodline of the invaders who finally breached the gates, settling down to build one of the wealthiest and most powerful empires in the region's history.